He was waiting to die, locked away for 12 long years, branded a murderer, forgotten by justice and by the world. But he never forgot one thing: his dog, a loyal German shepherd who never stopped waiting. And when he asked for one final wish, to see her again, no one expected what would follow, because that reunion changed everything. It uncovered a truth buried in silence. It exposed a lie protected by power. What this dog did will shatter your heart and rebuild your faith in loyalty, in justice, in miracles. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe dogs remember, if you believe love survives even behind bars, subscribe now. This story will stay with you forever. Early spring in Missouri wrapped the land in a quiet gray. Clouds hung low above St. Louis, and a fine mist drifted across the empty fields and silent neighborhoods. A thin chill clung to the wind, brushing against bare sycamore branches and cracked sidewalks, carrying with it the metallic scent of approaching rain. On the outskirts of the city, just past the faded welcome sign, sat the Willow Creek Animal Shelter, a low, weathered building with green metal roofing nestled against a grove of skeletal trees. Inside, the shelter was alive with noise: barks, yelps, scratching paws, and the occasional mewl from a stubborn cat. But one corner remained silent. There, in Kennel 7B, a large German shepherd lay curled in stillness. His name, faded on a worn leather collar, was Shadow. He was old, perhaps 10 or 11, his once glossy black and tan coat now dulled and patchy, with one ear slightly bent from an old injury. His eyes, amber but clouded with age, held a peculiar gravity. He rarely reacted to other dogs, never barked, never whined, just watched, waited. Every evening, at precisely sunset, he would rise, stretch his stiff limbs, and walk to the gate that faced west. There, he would sit, unmoving, and stare out past the trees toward the horizon. He would remain until the last sliver of light disappeared. Then, quietly, he would return to his corner and rest. The volunteers joked about his routine, but they didn't understand. Not really. Grace Monroe, 24, wasn't like the other volunteers. A psychology student at Lindenwood University, she had joined the shelter as part of a senior thesis on trauma in abandoned animals. Tall and willowy, with pale freckled skin and auburn curls she often tucked under a gray beanie, Grace had a quiet curiosity that unnerved some people. But around animals, she found peace, especially the broken ones. Shadow fascinated her. While others dismissed him as too far gone, she saw a mystery. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't fearful, he was grieving. That was the word that came to her. He grieved something or someone, and that made her heart ache. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Grace knelt outside Shadow's kennel. He lay facing away, as always, head resting on his crossed paws. She spoke softly. "Hey, buddy, you waiting for someone?" He didn't move, but his ear twitched. She narrowed her eyes, studying his collar again. The tag was worn almost smooth, but this time, with the light hitting just right, she saw something. Scratched into the leather beneath the name Shadow were the faint letters, Ethan M. She pulled out her phone and typed into the search bar, Ethan M. Missouri dog. Nothing. She tried again. Ethan M. Missouri crime. A headline popped up. Ethan Miles sentenced to death in 2009 homicide. Inmate maintains innocence. Grace blinked. Her breath caught in her throat. She clicked the article. Ethan Miles, then 30 years old, was convicted for the fatal shooting of a local shopkeeper during an alleged robbery in the summer of 2009. The case relied heavily on eyewitness testimony. Miles denied all charges. His appeals were exhausted. Execution scheduled, but no final date set. She scrolled down. In the middle of the article was a black and white photo, a man in handcuffs being led away by police. His face was worn, sunburned, with strong features and deep-set eyes. Behind him, in the corner of the frame, a blur of motion, a German shepherd, straining against its leash, mouth open in what looked like a howl. Grace stared at it. It couldn't be, could it? She looked up at Shadow, still curled on the kennel floor. "I think I found your person," she whispered. Shadow lifted his head slowly, turned, and locked eyes with her. For the first time since she'd known him, he rose and walked, carefully, painfully, to the glass gate separating them. He placed his paw against it, not scratching, just touching. Grace knelt, mirroring him. Her hand pressed against the other side of the glass. His paw trembled. She felt something sharp and ancient knot inside her chest. No one had ever come for Shadow. No one had called, written, or shown interest. He had simply appeared at the shelter 12 years ago, picked up on the roadside, thin and confused, with that collar and nothing more. No history, no known owner, just a name. But now, with the initials Ethan M. and that look in his eyes, Grace was sure. This dog had once belonged to the man in that article, and maybe he still did. She sat down on the floor beside the kennel. The rain had stopped. Outside, the clouds were thinning, revealing a sliver of gold beneath the sky. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, Shadow turned and walked to the gate, as he always did. Grace followed. He sat. She sat beside him, just beyond the fence. They watched the sky change colors. She whispered,
"Is that where he went? And you're still waiting?"
Shadow didn't move, but his chest rose and fell with a slow, deliberate breath. Grace looked at him, not just as a subject for research, not as another sad case, but as something sacred, a soul who had never let go. "Shadow," she said quietly, "did he name you because you followed him, or because you stayed with him in the dark?" Her voice cracked. "Or maybe because you were the only part of him no one could take away." Shadow looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, his tail thumped gently against the floor. Grace didn't sleep that night. After her discovery, her thoughts swirled with questions she couldn't silence. She lay in bed beneath a threadbare quilt in her small apartment just west of campus, her laptop glowing in the dark as she opened more articles about Ethan Miles. Each headline painted the same picture: convicted, no parole, execution pending. Yet, buried beneath the media noise were cracks in the narrative, timeline inconsistencies, missing footage, vague witness testimony. It was enough to stir something deep in her chest. Doubt. Not just in the conviction, but in the silence surrounding it. The next morning, the sky remained gray. Grace returned to Willow Creek Shelter and walked straight to Shadow's kennel. He was already waiting by the gate, amber eyes fixed on her like he'd been expecting this moment. Grace crouched by the gate and whispered, "I found him. Ethan. He's still alive." Shadow's head tilted slightly, a small exhale from his nose, the softest reaction, but it felt like confirmation. She knew what she had to do. She emailed the Missouri Department of Corrections with the subject line, "Regarding Ethan Miles, canine reunion request." She didn't expect a reply, certainly not within a day. But 24 hours later, Grace's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was gravelly and deliberate. "Miss Monroe, this is Joseph Whitmore, Assistant Warden, Pine Hill State Correctional." Joseph Whitmore was a man carved from old stone. In his early 70s, he had a frame that had once been powerful, but now moved with slow precision. He had a square jaw, thick gray brows, and deep creases beneath his tired hazel eyes that had seen too many good men break. His voice held a certain gravity, not the authority of rank, but the weight of someone who had quietly questioned the system from within for far too long. "I saw your message," he said, "and I remember Shadow. We've all heard the name before. Ethan never stopped talking about that dog, like he was holding on to him more than hope." Grace was silent for a beat. "Why are you calling me?" "Because I think you're right," he said plainly, "and I think that dog may know more than the courts ever cared to find out." Joseph had never bought the full story about Ethan's conviction. He had been a junior guard back then, a rule follower to the bone, but even in 2009, something about Officer Bradley Cole's testimony had rubbed him wrong. Cole had been the first on the scene, and the only witness who claimed to see Ethan leaving the crime location. The timeline was tight, too tight. And Bradley had always been slick. Charming, yes. Handsome, mid-40s now, clean-cut with piercing blue eyes and a tan that never faded. But underneath, there was something rehearsed about the way he moved, like a man who played a role and never broke character. Grace, emboldened by Joseph's quiet support, began gathering case documents, public records, old newspaper clippings, and her university's access to court archives. It wasn't easy. Some files had been sealed, others redacted, but the inconsistencies mounted. A 911 call was time-stamped 17 minutes before Bradley's claimed sighting. A witness's address no longer existed. And the surveillance footage from the shop across the street? Lost! According to the original case summary. She wasn't a lawyer, but she was stubborn. And Shadow. Shadow was watching her differently now. Less like a ghost, more like a soldier waiting for the next command. It took a week for Grace to receive formal permission. Pine Hill's rules were strict. Shadow had to be cleared medically. Grace had to sign multiple waivers. The drive from St. Louis to the prison was nearly 2 hours. She rented a used SUV, loaded Shadow into the back with a thick blanket and a water bowl, and they set out before dawn. The road was quiet, bordered by leafless trees and the occasional barn left in ruin. Shadow didn't make a sound the entire drive. He sat upright, alert, his eyes fixed out the window. Grace occasionally glanced at him in the rearview mirror and wondered how much he remembered. Did he know where they were going? They arrived just after 8 a.m. Pine Hill State Correctional loomed like a slab of concrete against the overcast sky. Gray walls, narrow towers, chain-link fences crowned with razor wire. Joseph Whitmore met them at the outer gate, wearing a faded brown uniform and a badge that had dulled with time. His handshake was warm but brief. "She looks good," he said, kneeling slowly to inspect Shadow. "Older, but proud." Grace nodded. "He's been waiting." Joseph led them to the visitation yard. It was a rectangular space enclosed by brick walls and narrow slots of sky above. One metal bench, one security camera, no windows. Ethan would be brought out in a few minutes. Grace sat on the bench, her heart pounding, Shadow lying beside her with his head raised, eyes flicking toward every sound. The steel door creaked open. Ethan Miles stepped into the yard, shackled at the wrists, flanked by 2 guards. His uniform was a washed-out gray. His dark hair had gone salt and pepper, and his beard was patchy, but his posture was straight. His eyes found Grace first, then dropped to Shadow. His breath hitched. For a moment, no one moved. Then Shadow stood. His ears pricked forward. He sniffed the air. And without a sound, he began to walk. Slowly at first, then quicker. The guards tensed, but Joseph raised a hand. "Let him go." Shadow broke into a trot, then a full run. The leash slipped from Grace's hand. The German Shepherd reached Ethan just as he dropped to his knees, letting the chains clatter to the concrete. Shadow pushed his head into Ethan's chest with a guttural cry, half bark, half sob. Ethan clung to him, burying his face in the scruff of Shadow's neck, and whispered, "You came back. You came back." Grace turned away, wiping her eyes. From the far corner, another figure approached. Officer Bradley Cole, broad-shouldered and crisp in his blue uniform. His presence was commanding but cold. His face betrayed no emotion, but his steps were deliberate as he walked toward the reunion. That's when it happened. Shadow stiffened. His body shifted between Ethan and Bradley. A low rumble began in his chest, a warning. Bradley paused. Shadow's growl deepened. His ears flattened, his body low and tense, eyes locked on the officer like he was tracking prey. It was nothing like the reunion a moment before. This was defensive, primal. Bradley frowned. "What's wrong with the mutt?" Joseph narrowed his eyes. "He doesn't growl. Not ever." Shadow took a step forward, his hackles raised. Grace grabbed the leash, gently pulled him back, her voice shaking. "Shadow, hey! It's okay! Easy!" But it wasn't okay.
Because something had shifted in the air. Something old, hidden, suddenly stirred.
And Joseph Whitmore, standing a few feet away, whispered to himself, "I knew it. I always knew." The air inside Joseph Whitmore's office felt heavier than usual. The overhead light hummed low, flickering faintly, as if protesting the silence that had swallowed the room. Joseph sat at his desk, a faded oak piece with nicks and scratches older than some of the guards in the prison. He rubbed his thumb across a creased manila folder marked Miles Ethan, Case Archive. His gut had told him for years that something about Bradley Cole's testimony didn't sit right. Now, with Shadow's reaction still echoing in his mind, and Grace Monroe's persistence breathing new life into old doubts, Joseph decided it was time to pull the thread and see what unraveled. Joseph, though aging, still carried the quiet authority of a man who'd earned his years with caution, not bluster. He stood over 6 feet tall, his build slightly stooped, but his presence intact. A faded army tattoo peeked out from under the cuff of his sleeve. He had learned over time that justice was rarely swift and often silent. That night, when most of the prison had gone dark, he used his clearance to enter the document storage vault, deep beneath Pine Hill's administration wing. His key turned with a reluctant click. Inside, under a haze of dust and yellowed fluorescence, Joseph sifted through boxes labeled with numbered stickers and brittle tape. When he found the original Miles file, he didn't read it right away. He stared at the spine, as if weighing whether the truth would be worth the burden. Then he opened it. The first thing he noticed was a time-stamped discrepancy on the witness report filed by Officer Bradley Cole. The report claimed Cole had seen Ethan leaving the victim's property at 7:43 p.m., but another page, a police dispatch log stapled in the wrong direction, showed that a 911 call had been logged at 7:27 p.m., placing the crime at least 16 minutes earlier. More troubling, a page referencing security camera footage from a traffic light near North Elm and Miller Street had been scratched out with pen, then retyped, with a different timestamp and no video reference at all. Joseph's jaw tightened. He'd seen this kind of erasure before, not by mistake, but by intent. Back in St. Louis, Grace sat cross-legged on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by printouts, highlighters, and folders. Her laptop displayed several open tabs, including an old traffic cam database run by the Department of Transportation. Her roommate's cat, Pancake, a sleepy tabby with one eye and a missing ear, lounged atop a stack of legal pads like a furry paperweight. Grace didn't notice. Suddenly her phone buzzed. The text read, "Check email, Joseph." She opened the file attachment. It was the scanned police log showing the conflicting time entries. Her heart thudded. Then, another message came through, this one from a familiar name, Nate Wallace. Nate was a third-year law student, tall and lanky, with eternally unkempt hair and a crooked smile that made people underestimate how sharp he really was. He was also Grace's study partner, sarcasm dealer, and the only person who didn't think her thesis was too emotional for law school. Nate had been keeping tabs on her research and offered to look at the case from a legal angle. "What you have here is cause for a writ of habeas corpus," he said when she showed him the documents in the student legal aid lounge the next morning. "If the original witness testimony is flawed and evidence was tampered with or ignored, this case should have never gone to sentencing, let alone death row." Grace leaned forward. "Would you help me file?" Nate rubbed the back of his neck. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't already drafting something." Meanwhile, Joseph wasn't the only one reliving buried instincts. At Willow Creek Shelter, a new volunteer named Doug Pritchard had joined the team for weekend help. Doug was in his mid-50s, heavy-set, with gray hair combed back and watery eyes that rarely blinked. He spoke little, smiled even less, and always requested to work alone. On paper, he had passed the background checks. But on his first Saturday, when Doug walked near Shadow's kennel, the dog's reaction was instantaneous. His body went rigid. The low growl returned, not unlike the one from the prison yard. Then, a snap, sharp and sudden, as Shadow barked, lunging against the fencing so hard the metal rang out. Grace had seen it before, only twice. Once at the prison with Bradley Cole, and now with Doug. Doug flinched but didn't respond, only muttered something, and moved to a different hall. Later that day, another volunteer mentioned he recognized Doug from a local news piece. Grace checked the shelter's computer records and found something chilling. Doug Pritchard had once been investigated, but never charged, for operating an unlicensed kennel where multiple dogs were found abused. Charges had been dropped for lack of evidence. But Shadow remembered. Grace documented the incident and added it to her growing file of canine behavioral observations related to trauma and instinct. She called it Case Echo. But her focus stayed locked on Ethan's case. With Nate's help, she tracked down archived transportation footage from the week of the murder. They hit dead ends for days, missing files, corrupted timestamps, misdated reports. But then, through a municipal server in Jefferson County, they found a backup. A single clip, 38 seconds long. It showed a man matching Ethan's build at a diner 2 miles from the crime scene at exactly 7:28 p.m., 1 minute after the 911 call had been logged. The footage was blurry but time-stamped and confirmed by the diner's receipt records. He couldn't have been at both places.
Nate leaned back in the chair, breathless. This is real. This is enough for judicial review."
Grace closed her laptop and looked down at Shadow, who lay by the door as always. He watched her, not with panic or urgency, but with a quiet knowing, like he'd been waiting for this all along. The courthouse in Jefferson County stood tall against a storm-gray sky, its aged columns chipped by time but dignified in their stillness. On the morning of the retrial, reporters lined the courthouse steps like crows waiting for a verdict of fate. Satellite trucks jammed the curb, their long metal spines stabbing toward the clouds. Inside, security buzzed louder than usual, and people spoke in hushed tones, aware they were about to witness something rare, an act of reversal in a system notorious for finality. Grace Monroe adjusted the collar of her navy blazer as she stood in the hallway outside courtroom 2B. Her red curls were pulled tightly into a bun, her eyes steady but sleepless. She clutched her binder full of documents to her chest, the same way she had clutched her textbooks years ago during finals. Only this time, a man's life rested in the balance. Beside her stood Nate Wallace, unshaven, tie slightly crooked, holding a folder thicker than any law professor's exam. Despite the gravity of the day, his voice still found the room for dry humor. "Remind me again why we didn't just become baristas?" Grace smiled weakly. Too much pressure. In the courtroom, Shadow sat at the feet of Ethan Miles, just to the left of the defense table. The German Shepherd, now a living symbol of loyalty, was freshly groomed, his black and tan coat brushed until it glistened. At 11 years old, his frame was lean, and his movements slow but controlled. He stayed perfectly still, ears alert, eyes fixed on the rows behind them, especially the seat where Officer Bradley Cole would soon sit. Ethan, dressed in a borrowed charcoal suit with sleeves too short and shoes a size too big, kept a hand resting gently on Shadow's shoulder. He hadn't spoken much that morning. He didn't need to. The presence of his dog seemed to do it for him. The judge entered. Judge Marianne Cleary, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair pinned into a no-nonsense twist, wore thick black glasses and a permanent expression of restrained impatience. Known for her fairness and iron will, she had presided over dozens of appeals, but rarely reversed course. Today, however, her tone was different, curious, almost open. "This hearing is convened to examine new evidence in the case of Missouri v. Ethan Miles, and to determine whether prior proceedings were compromised," she began, her voice crisp and deliberate. The courtroom hushed. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Clay Dorn, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp brown eyes, known for his calculated manner and confidence in procedure. But even he seemed cautious today. His usual swagger dulled. First to speak was Joseph Whitmore. He walked to the witness stand with a slight limp, dressed in a pressed tan suit that didn't quite hide the wear of prison years. His voice, though soft, carried weight. "I served at Pine Hill for 32 years, he began. "I watched hundreds of men come and go, some guilty, some not. But this case, this one never sat right." He explained the inconsistencies in Bradley Cole's report, the hidden pages he uncovered in the archive room, the time-stamped 911 call that contradicted the officer's testimony. As he spoke, several jurors leaned forward. Judge Cleary narrowed her eyes, taking notes. Then came Grace. She presented the diner surveillance video, the one showing Ethan entering a local diner just minutes after the alleged crime had occurred. Nate followed with the receipt records. The time discrepancy was no longer a theory. It was documented fact. When Bradley Cole was called to testify, he walked to the stand with the same polished demeanor he always wore. Mid-40s, square jaw, steely eyes, a uniform too pristine to feel lived in. He kept his expression neutral, but as he spoke, Shadow's ears flicked forward. The dog stood up slowly, body tense. Grace watched from the gallery. Ethan placed a hand gently on Shadow's back, whispering, "Stay." But Shadow didn't relax. His gaze stayed fixed on Cole like a spotlight. Cole recited the same statement from 12 years ago, but this time, the words fell hollow. The defense pressed him on the 911 timestamp. He hesitated, then stammered. He claimed poor memory, confusion over the time. When asked why the diner footage had been omitted, he claimed he'd never seen it. It didn't help him. Outside, reporters scribbled furiously. Inside, the courtroom grew electric. Then, a surprise. Frank Daly, a seasoned defense attorney in his late 60s with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for bluntness, stood up from the back row. Years ago, he had refused to take Ethan's case, citing it a no-win. Today he asked to speak before the court. Judge Cleary raised a brow. "Mr. Daly, you're not listed as counsel." "No, Your Honor," he said, standing respectfully, "but I am here to apologize." He turned to the courtroom. "I reviewed this case 12 years ago and decided it wasn't worth my name. I made that call based on flawed evidence, and more shamefully, on assumptions. That was a mistake. Ethan Miles deserved a better defense than silence." A hush fell over the room. Even Cole turned slightly, as if caught in a drift he didn't anticipate. In the final moments, the jury was shown Shadow's behavioral report, documenting how the dog had reacted violently only twice in 12 years, once toward a known animal abuser, and once toward Officer Cole. It wasn't a legal weapon, but it struck a chord. The room fell still as Judge Cleary leaned forward. Given the credibility of the new evidence, the inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline, the lack of full disclosure in the original trial, and the strength of supporting documentation, this court finds the conviction of Ethan Miles to be vacated. Gasps, then tears. Ethan sat motionless. Then he let out a sound. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. Shadow pressed his body against him and closed his eyes. Behind the press bench, Clay Dorn stood stiffly. A moment later, Judge Cleary added, "Furthermore, an investigation will be launched into the actions of Officer Bradley Cole. This court will not tolerate compromised justice." From the rear row, Sheriff Dale Rooks, a stout, blunt-faced man with a graying mustache and creased eyes, stood. He was sheriff of St. Louis County for over 20 years. Until today, he had never questioned the conviction. Now, he walked to the press and spoke clearly. "We're opening a full internal review of all officers involved in the original investigation. If anyone tampered with evidence, they'll answer for it." Outside the courthouse, as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Ethan stepped down the marble stairs beside Grace and Nate. Shadow walked between them, head high. In that moment, he wasn't just a dog. He was truth, walking on 4 legs. The forest at the edge of Cedar Hollow swayed gently under the warmth of a late summer breeze. Golden sunlight filtered through oak and hickory trees, casting long, dappled shadows across the porch of a modest log cabin. The cabin stood alone at the edge of a clearing, its cedar siding weathered but sturdy, its windows open to let in the crisp air of a world made new. It was quiet here, the kind of quiet Ethan Miles had forgotten existed. No buzzing fluorescent lights, no iron doors slamming, just birdsong, rustling leaves, and the soft shuffle of a dog's paws across the wooden floor. Ethan stepped onto the porch barefoot, holding a steaming mug of black coffee in one hand and a leather-bound journal in the other. His hair had grown longer, curling slightly at the neck, and the lines around his eyes had softened. He wore a faded blue flannel shirt and worn jeans that hung a little loose on his lean frame. Each morning still felt like waking from a long dream, one he hadn't dared believe he'd escape, but the smell of pine and the creak of the porch swing grounded him in the truth. He was free. At his feet lay Shadow, the black and tan German shepherd who had once waited every sunset for a man the world forgot. Now, he no longer stood vigil. He slept soundly, breathing in rhythm with the wind. His muzzle had grayed further, and his movements had slowed, but his spirit remained sharp. When Ethan sat beside him, Shadow lifted his head and nudged Ethan's hand gently before settling again with a sigh of contentment. The cabin had been a gift from an anonymous donor, someone who had followed Ethan's story and purchased the property through a local nonprofit dedicated to reintegrating exonerees. Grace had found it, tucked away just south of the Mark Twain National Forest, and arranged for the paperwork. She visited every weekend, sometimes more, bringing fresh groceries, her camera, and pages of research for the program they were now building together. Grace Monroe, now 25, had grown into herself with remarkable steadiness. Her curls were shorter now, cropped just above her shoulders, and her posture had changed too, less guarded, more rooted. She no longer wore thrift store layers, but simple button-ups and soft canvas pants she could kneel in when working with dogs. She had become a voice, calm, reasoned, passionate, for those who had been left behind. One afternoon, sitting at the cabin's reclaimed pine kitchen table, Grace handed Ethan a thick envelope. "It's official," she said. "The Missouri Animal Justice Coalition has nominated Shadow for honorary recognition." Ethan raised an eyebrow. They give awards to dogs now? Grace grinned. They do when the dog triggers a full judicial investigation and helps free a man from death row. A month later, they stood together in the auditorium of Missouri State University, where the annual Animal Rights and Rehabilitation Conference took place. The stage was modest, lined with folding chairs and ivy. The audience, activists, scholars, trainers, and legal advocates, listened attentively as the MC introduced the next speaker. Grace Monroe, co-founder of the Second Light Project and advocate for trauma-informed animal care. Grace stepped to the podium in a navy blazer, voice steady. "This," she began, "is not just a story about a man wrongly convicted. It is about memory, about instinct, about what love looks like when time forgets and hope fades." Behind her on the projection screen, a photo appeared, Shadow leaping into Ethan's arms during their reunion at the prison yard. "And this," she continued, "is the dog who remembered, who protected, who warned us when something was wrong. This is Shadow, a dog who waited, and in waiting, helped turn justice back toward the light." The audience rose in a standing ovation. Later, in a sunlit courtyard, Dr. Helena Sloan, a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her early 50s, with steel-gray hair and a commanding voice, approached them. She was a behavioral psychologist known nationally for her work with service animals and veterans. She shook Grace's hand firmly and offered Shadow a gentle pat on the head. "You just changed the conversation," she said. "This case, it's going to redefine how we understand animal intuition in trauma cases." Grace nodded, overwhelmed. Back at the cabin, Ethan spent his afternoons writing. The book was titled Shadow's Truth. It wasn't a memoir of his suffering. He had no interest in retelling the pain, but rather a tribute to the creature who had saved him twice, once by never giving up, and once by simply being believed. His handwriting, though stiff, flowed with unexpected clarity. He wrote of their first night together, when he found a terrified puppy behind a dumpster and named her Shadow because she never left his side. He wrote about the nights in prison when he dreamed only of her warmth. And he wrote about the moment she stood between him and the man who had lied, as if she could smell the betrayal. The story was not just his. It was theirs. Some evenings, Grace would sit by the porch rail, sipping tea while reading aloud drafts of the manuscript. Shadow lay nearby, occasionally lifting his head at the sound of his name, as if to check the facts. There were moments of laughter, too, like when Ethan, still getting used to freedom, bought a bulk order of bananas online because he didn't understand how Amazon worked, or when Shadow stole Grace's sandwich from the table and buried it in the garden, then proudly stood over the dirt like he had planted a tree. One golden afternoon, as the sky flared with orange and rose, Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the light dance through the trees. Shadow sat beside him, gaze steady. "You don't wait at the door anymore," Ethan said quietly. "I think, you know we're home." Shadow thumped his tail once against the earth. As the sun dipped lower, casting their shadows long across the grass, Ethan placed his hand gently on Shadow's back. "I owe you more than life," he whispered. "I owe you the truth." And so he wrote it. He lived it. And in the quiet haven they built from ruin, love became their language again. Sometimes, the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or light from the heavens. They come on 4 legs, with tired eyes and unwavering loyalty. Shadow didn't speak, but his presence told the truth. In a world where lies can send an innocent man to the edge of death, it was a silent dog's memory that brought light into the shadows. This story is more than a reunion. It's a testimony to faith, to love that endures beyond years and fences and silence. And maybe, just maybe, it's also a reminder that God sends his angels in unexpected forms, not with wings, but with paws. In our daily lives, we often overlook small signs: the neighbor who smiles despite pain, the dog who refuses to leave your side, the moment your heart tells you to keep hoping when logic tells you to give up. Don't ignore those moments, because God works through the quiet ones too. If this story moved you, if you believe that loyalty can change destinies and that God never forgets the innocent, share this message, leave a comment, subscribe to our channel to hear more true stories like this. And in the comments, type amen if you believe in second chances, in divine timing, and in the sacred bond between a man and his dog. May God bless you and your loved ones, always.